everyone. Welcome to another episode of CRMprov. I'm your host, Mickey Baines. For all or any or individuals, however many there are out there that have not seen the show before, thank you for joining us for the first time. We're a podcast focused on higher education and thinking about the role of CRM in higher ed, how CRM can grow in higher ed. Our content is tailored towards end users, functional owners, and strategists looking to better leverage their technology to serve and support their prospective and current students and their alumni. Today, we've got a great guest. I'm really excited. We've been waiting for weeks to pull this together, so I'm really excited to have Evan Hamilton on the show with us. We're going to go all in on communities. That's a really big topic for me, and I want us to look at why communities succeed, why communities fail. And just let me tell you a little bit about Evan before we get going, because I'm ready to dive in. But Evan is the director of community at HubSpot, one of my favorite companies to watch and follow. He's been with HubSpot for over 7 years now. And prior to that, he spent about 5 years or so at Reddit, among other roles. But when he's at Reddit, he last served as the director of community and customer experience. Evan, you're a customer experience and community professional with experience across multiple industries. In my work in following you and seeing you present at the HubSpot conference this year, you're really focused and dialed in on how to build, grow, and develop strong communities. And I couldn't think of anyone more equipped and ready to have this conversation. You know, when I first connected with you to say, hey, would you be interested in joining the podcast? I'm assuming you had a question. Well, why a podcast on higher ed CRM? And I like to find people outside of higher ed because you're doing things different ways. And I think that helps us think of different ways inside of higher ed. Sometimes higher ed's a little behind other industries. Sometimes we're not, but there's always good learning, I think, that we can find way other industries do. And to be fair, when I attended your session at Inbound, it was on, I think it was the 5 reasons communities fail. And I don't want it to all be about failure, but I think there's so much to be learned in what's not working that we can apply to really improve that. And I can't tell you that I've been on a college campus in my career, either in higher ed or as a consultant with higher ed, when the thought or conversation around building a community for our students and our learners is not mentioned in reference. So I think it's a great topic to have. So Evan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I'm super excited to talk higher ed. It's always good for me to get out of my comfort zone and talk with a different group.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I don't mean to be the community doomer. That wasn't the point of my talk. But
and I will say it did come across as that way. I think there was that one line. What was that one line on every slide? It was something about fail or something. It was so
most
funny.
Communities fail because, and yeah, there's
because.
Community, I think, often gets the misconception that it's just, you just throw up a space, people go and talk, and boom, you're done. And it's a lot more work, but if you pull it off, the upside is really high. So happy to dig in.
Absolutely. So, let's start with the first, maybe the biggest question that will help define and maybe direct our follow-up conversation. What is community?
Yeah. It's a subject of hot debate constantly. I was just in a meeting this week where someone was trying to decide if they were going to name a feature a community. And I said, no, please don't. I try to put more of a strict definition to it because I think we get in these, sort of aesthetic conversations about like, well, any human connection is a community, but practically, what does it mean when you're looking at a business, when you're looking at an organization? And for me, a community is a group of people coming together around a shared interest, mission, situation, and gaining value out of interacting with each other. Not super complicated. It's more than one person. Community of one doesn't quite work. They have something in common, and that could be anything from, they are in the same industry to they have the same hobbies, they have the same disease. There's all sorts of commonalities. And then they're gaining value out of interacting. And that interacting part is really important to me because I hear a lot of people describe their newsletter community, right? Or their blog community. And those are audiences. And audiences are great. I have a newsletter. It's great. I get benefits from it. But those people aren't interacting. Those people aren't a group that sees themselves as one. And if they ran into each other in the street, they'd be like, you're part of that community. Amazing. They'd go, oh, you subscribe to Evan's newsletter. Okay. So I think that interaction part is really crucial. And that can take a lot of forms, right? It can be conversations, but it could also be, you're working on a piece of open source software and then you write some code and someone else writes some code that interacts with it. There are different forms of interaction, but I think that part is really crucial.
Um, that interaction. I love that we've got parameters. So interaction is key. One of the things that really stood out to me in the session that I had thought or considered before, but you really hit it home, is the focus of a community in terms of its ability to be successful, or likelihood maybe to be successful. Um, and when we say niche or micro niche, I think you took it to another level. But I'm an idea person, so as you were talking, I wrote down, I don't know how many other ideas for communities for higher ed. As you were talking, like, oh, these ideas kept coming in my head.
Okay.
And so, but when I'm on a college campus, or if I'm talking online on Zoom with a school, when we start talking community, a lot of times when they say community, they may mean their students versus alumni, and thinking of those as two different communities. And that's not what we're talking about in terms of a niche or micro niche. And as I said before, as we were chatting before we recorded, like, yeah, they're students. But I'm not even talking first year students. I'm talking like first year students in this residence hall who like to bake, like that. You can tell me if you disagree with that. Please do. This is open. But when I think micro niche, that's where my mind goes, and I think there's a deeper likelihood that I could get that group, if they're connected together, to engage and interact very organically, because
Yeah,
there's a shared topic.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you alluded to the five things in my talk, and the five things are
Yep.
5 types of value. Community has to deliver value. And I think, we had the initial stage of the web where it was just a novelty to talk to people who weren't in the same room as you. We had the Web 2.0 era where, I could meet people with my same interests. And so just being in the same room with them was powerful.
Mm-hmm.
We're now in the ubiquitous web era, right? Anyone can get essentially access to anyone. They can find anyone with a common interest. And so just putting people in a room isn't really enough. You have to be delivering some sort of unique value to them. There's a lot of ways you can do that, but one of the most effective is to think about niche and to think about, well, the more specific this is to my identity, the more value I'm going to get. And the example I often use is, if I told you, hey, I'm inviting you to a community of humans who live on planet Earth. They're going to talk about things humans who live on planet Earth care about. You'd be like, that's very vague, and sure, but I don't know how much I'm going to have in common. We're not even going to all speak the same language. If I said, people in the Western Hemisphere, you'd be like, okay, well, maybe we can talk about the socio-political. I don't know. If I said people on your street, then you're like, okay, now I actually I can talk about the wood chipper that's right outside my window right now making noise while I'm trying to record a podcast. I can talk about, how the store down the street closed down. Okay, that's much more useful. So the more niche you get, the more value you can drive. There's other ways you can drive value by facilitating conversations, by creating events and structure that drive value. But I think that niche is really crucial because people need to have a reason that they want to join. And I again, 10 years ago, you could just say, you all go to the same campus, talk to each other, and it was kind of a novelty. I don't think it is now. I think people know they can find that. And so you have to be providing something kind of above and beyond.
Yes. Well, because as you think about as you describe that, I'm thinking, I'm on several Facebook groups, and the ones I'm least engaged with. So my hobby, one of my hobbies, is we like to RV as a family. We like to travel. We've got a fifth wheel RV, and we take it and go up all over the place in the summer. There are groups out there that talk about RVing, but then there are groups that might talk about RVing in RVs that are made by the manufacturer of my RV. But there's even a group that's people who have this particular model of this RV. And there's a lot of talk about where you go, but there's also talk about specific modifications or renovations you've made to that RV. What have you done to make it unique to you? And that really makes it relevant. And that is probably, when I think of all the groups that I've engaged with, that's the one that I am really most in. I also love live music, and there are a couple of bands I really follow, and those are maybe a little bit more where we can actually talk. What was the set list on the show? Why do you think they put that song third? Like, that could be a conversation in that type of a group. And so that's niche and direct.
Yeah.
And it's also very engaging. But if it's broader, I don't go back to just look at all of those things. I'm not that engaged.
Yeah, I think the music, both those examples are fantastic. People use RVs in different ways. different RVs are very different experiences. I think the music one too, we try and think about, oh, what's the biggest, total addressable market? What's the biggest TAM that we can reach? You think, oh, well, let's do everyone who loves music. Well, there are a lot of different opinions in music. You could even go down to a niche and say everyone who loves Americana music. But frankly, that has a bunch of niches within it. And I like a lot of Americana music, and there's plenty I don't like, And so it's just you're sacrificing the value and the ongoing engagement for the TAM, right? And so there's a balance, because you can obviously go so niche that you're like people who like Blitzen Trapper who have this certain RV and live in California, and you're like, okay, it's 5 people now. The ROI isn't there for me. So you have to figure out where on the spectrum you land. It's absolutely a spectrum, but the more niche you go, the more likely people are going to get value out of it, engage with it regularly, and contribute, right? Because if it's a generic music community, where is my motivation to contribute? If it's a specific band community, I'm like, oh, I know that these people are going to love it if I upload the set list, or I know if I contribute, then someone else is going to share their bootleg recording of that show, and I'm going to get something out of it. And so, you have to figure out where on the spectrum you go, because there are operating costs that come with it.
So how do you say we want to go down, and I'm thinking, oh, I love this idea. I want to go niche. How do you get started? How do you determine which groups to focus on? How does that process begin?
Well, I would start with what the goals are for your organization, right? I see a lot of B2B companies saying, we're going to create a community for everyone in marketing. That's a very large group. That's also not necessarily the people you care about, right? Recent graduate who's in an IC1 marketing role isn't going to be a decision maker about software, so don't you want to look up market? If we're thinking about students on a campus, what is your goal? Are you trying to retain students who you're worried might drop out? Are you trying to make sure your top students have a really good experience so that when they go on and make tons of money because they're the top students, that they're donating back as alumni? Are you trying to create a experience that is going to bring more students in, and so you really want to figure out what are incoming students interested in? I think that's where you start, and then within that there's going to be multiple niches you can look at. But it's very different if I'm looking at students who might be on the verge of dropping out. Well, wow, I want to think about study groups. I want to think about how do I get them closer to their campus so they feel, okay, I'm going to lose some really important social connection if I lose this. If I'm thinking about top students, I might be thinking about how am I helping them get career opportunities? How am I keeping them from burning out because maybe they're working really hard? So they're very different communities. And so I think that's the place to start. And then, come up with some theses and then test them. And I'm a big fan of testing, the same way that product teams test, where you do a really small version.
Test. Yes.
And then you look at the results and you make a decision where to invest. And so I highly encourage folks to come up with a couple theses as to groups that might get value, and then host one event for them, or do a month-long community. Do something that's really time-boxed. Do more than one, because you don't want to just test one thesis. And then take a step back and say, well, what results did we get from this? Did the students who were involved love it? Or were they like, it was fine? Did we see any of our core metrics? I'm not sure what you measure in higher ed for retention or student happiness, but whatever score there, did that go up in those groups? And then you can look at that and say, well, this was most promising. Let's start here, and then let's double down on it. And so that's generally the approach I take.
And I like the at-risk component when we talk about academic themed maybe study groups. It could also be academic interest for folks beyond just being at risk. That it could be folks who like to do research. It could be psychology-based research types of groups. I even thought about one for alumni. I was just thinking if you are a graduate and you're in a position that does research, maybe there's a community around focus groups, how to conduct focus groups, or people do that for a living. There's probably some really robust conversation that would happen in that type of community.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you have a fledgling robotics program and you really want to make that a top tier program, well, you want to make sure every single person in that robotics program is having an amazing experience and telling others about it. You want to amplify that so people who are looking for a school with a good robotics program hear about it. There's so many specific things you can do then there that aren't just, hey, you go here, here's a room to hang out in, but actually, okay, well,
Yes.
can we have a robotics hackathon? Can we bring in a speaker that you wouldn't normally hear from? Can we make sure that every single robotics student is talking to each other? There's so much you can do once you narrow in on your goal. But so frequently I find that people start with just, well, we know we need a community. We're going to make one as big as possible. And then all of a sudden they have a bunch of people kind of standing around wondering why they're there.
So if we were to do that, is it who owns the community? I mean, do the students own it? How do we make that decision? Or maybe ownership's not the right word. Who manages? Maybe those are two different questions. But how does that work? And what is the role the college university should play in owning and managing that group? If it's too controlled, I'm assuming that's going to impact your ability for the community to thrive and feel open enough to really engage.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a couple really good questions in there. The first one is, are you hosting or not? There's obvious benefits to hosting a community, right? You have all the data, you can control how it's set up, you can control the spaces. The downside is you're going to have to get people to come in there, right? The other side of the spectrum is, not hosting it, having it on Facebook or Reddit, etc. People are already there. It's really easy to get them to join, but you're not going to have access to the data or very little data. You have very little control. You're kind of at the whim of an algorithm or decisions from the company. Even when I worked at Reddit, I tell people, I don't know, I wouldn't host your community on Reddit. But there's also the idea of, well, what if we don't host and what if we participate in existing communities? And that's a very valid approach, especially if there's already a really strong community. It's going to be hard for you to come up with a value prop that beats that. That also means they have to move somewhere else. And so, if your university has a really strong community on Reddit and you're like, I just don't think we have a pitch that's going to beat it, then can you go spend time there? Can you contribute there and provide value there? Yes, you're going to have less control, you're going to have less data, but it's also going to be a lower overhead.
Yep.
I think, the second question you had nested in there is how much control you do exert. And that spectrum I really think of as, the less control you have, the more participation and ownership you're going to see from members, but the more chaos you're going to see. And the more control you exert, the less chaos you will see, the less participation you will get. It's the same thing as working at an organization, right? If you feel like your boss micromanages you, you're just going to do the bare minimum and just be like, just tell me what to do next. You're not going to go above and beyond. But it's going to be very regimented and controlled, no chaos. If your boss says, like, I don't even care what you do, don't leave me alone, don't talk to me, you're going to go do some really interesting things, but you might also cause some chaos. And you can see this in Reddit. There was a period in Reddit's history where the company had let the community completely own it, and it had driven a ton of growth, but it had also created these really nasty corners of Reddit that were scaring off women, that were scaring off advertisers, that were scaring off people of color, and it was becoming a problem. And so then we had to, the time I joined was when the company was correcting a little bit back to the center and saying, hey, we need to exert some control to make sure this is a place people want to be. So, that's the other part you need to think about. And that will probably be more specific to, your university, your bylaws, your specific area you're focused on. And then the last part you mentioned is who manages it. And that relates to that, spectrum of control, because the more ownership you can give the community, the more they're going to want to participate and contribute. If you can drive a ton of value for them and make it really easy for them to help out, they will. And Reddit is a great example of this. Even just from the user perspective, Reddit allows people to upvote and downvote things. So it's building in this curation system that actually isn't reliant on an AI algorithm, but in fact, human beings saying this thing's good, this thing isn't. And when the first round of Russian misinformation came through, Reddit was actually pretty immune, because human beings were looking at this content and saying, nope, that's junk content, we're going to vote that down. Reddit moderators are volunteers who come in, clean up the subreddits, post things to get people engaged, host events. These folks are doing it for free because they get a lot of value. It's very niche, so it's the thing they really deeply care about. And they feel like, okay, this is my space that I can contribute to. And so you do want to think about, what level of chaos are you comfortable with? Where do you want to draw the lines? But the more you can say like, hey, this is your group and we're enabling you. We're going to give you funds. We're going to give you space. We're going to give you format, whatever that those community members need to execute.
Mm-hmm.
The more you can do that, the more that they're going to take it and run with it, and the less overhead you have.
Yep. A lot of good information packed in there. And, some of the things that run through my mind, as I think about from a CRM perspective, selfishly, I want data. And I think where I have my own battle is, to what extent do I need the data versus want the participation and the engagement? Um, and I know that comes into testing. To me, in my mind, you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think it's a more expensive in terms of time and potentially money cost if I'm debating owned versus unowned versus testing different audience types. And part of that is because I'm thinking if I own it, then I might own the platform, or at least license out a platform. And if it's unowned, then I might be on a Reddit or a Facebook or some group like that. And that's now really spreading my time out in multiple places. So I know it's not an easy decision.
Yeah.
Where do you see most of your the clients that you work with in terms of their community? Where do you see them really navigating in terms of a platform?
I see a lot of folks kind of land in between with something like Slack, where it's not completely unowned, right? There's not this mysterious algorithm. The company isn't going to suddenly shut down your group, but it's designed for a specific thing. It isn't giving you, full flexibility. So you can absolutely set things up to pull information out of there. You can use Common Room. There's other plugins that kind of let you ask for those things, but you're not going to be able to make the space look super unique. You're not going to be able to really host content. There's some limitations there, but that's where a lot of folks end up. And that's where we've been doing a lot of our testing, because it straddles that line where people are very familiar with Slack. It's very easy to just, okay, great, I'm going to go join this new Slack, versus something that is a completely new space. Generally, the trend I see is kind of over time, communities move towards that totally owned platform because they're just going to be able to get more out of it. But sometimes when you're trying to kickstart, it's just nice to have that leg up.
And I like that idea. And gosh, I'm too much of a novice, I think, in communities, because Slack hasn't even crossed my mind. And if you knew the amount of time I spend with clients talking about ways to grow the use of Salesforce, who owns Slack, in case you don't know very much, but I really like that idea. And that's something I know I'm going to take away from this conversation is, okay, if we think about it as maybe an easier tool to get started with, as at least a platform to get started with, to build out a community, I have an option there. And you don't have to have Salesforce, by the way, to use that. But if I'm thinking selfishly about data, there's more I can collect from that might help me understand what's happening with the community, who's engaged, how it's being engaged. I might be able to understand a little bit more if I do have Salesforce with that. Okay.
Yeah. And again, a tool like Common Room, et cetera, will allow you to pull a lot of data from there, attach it to existing data you have in your CRM, including HubSpot, which I feel obligated to throw out there. And, there are some ways that you can actually ask people for things like email. So I think then, I was a Slack skeptic for a long time, I will admit. I've kind of capitulated because I do think it gets that middle ground decently. And then, it does cost money. It does cost development resources, et cetera, to host your own space. And so it may be good to start somewhere where you're like, the overhead is relatively low. Slack can cost a lot if you want to retain the data, but if you're okay with the previous conversations disappearing after a period of time, then it's very cheap. It can be a good place to really kind of put your stake in the ground. And then once you have enough momentum, you can move people over. And migrating communities is painful, but it absolutely can be done.
Okay. Well, Evan, I think we're at a great pausing point. I think you've given us a lot of good information to develop another level of questions that we may have about community. But thank you so much for taking time out to join us for this really important conversation. I know you've got a newsletter. I've subscribed. I've been reading it very routinely. Love the content. I think we can subscribe from your website, correct?
Mm-hmm.
EvanHamilton.com. We can get you there.
Yeah.
You're also connected and engaged on LinkedIn. So everyone, you can search for Evan on LinkedIn as well. So any other places that folks can find you where you publish more information content? I don't know if you're on X or Instagram, any of those.
Yeah, I've been spending a little bit more time on Threads. So if you haven't checked out
Threads.
Threads
Okay.
yet, yeah, check me out there.
Oh, that's right. Threads. Yep. Okay.
Yeah. And yeah,
Perfect.
newsletter once a week, 3 curated links from across the web about community, nothing more. Keep it very simple.
Yep,
And then
definitely not a pitch. This is real good content. That's what I'm always looking for. Real content
yeah,
that helps you think through. And again, a niche type topic for us when we think about community.
yeah.
So it's a really good newsletter.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then if people
Yeah.
want to go deeper, I did just actually launch a course called Driving Business Impact with Community.
That's right. You did. And you've already sold out one cohort. You got another cohort coming up next month.
Yeah.
So if you're looking to really dive in and think about how to build and plan your community, you have that course coming up in January. Is that available that we can sign up through your website?
Yeah, you can find it in the nav on my website, or you can find it on maven.com. But yeah, next cohort coming up late January. And it's really just everything I've learned across over 15 years jam-packed into 2 weeks.
So, by the way, congratulations on selling out cohort number one for that. I'm not surprised at all. I'm sure you picked up some folks from that session at the Inbound conference because it was phenomenal.
Thank you.
So
Well,
again, thank you so much.
Yeah, if any higher ed folks join, they should tell me how to teach my course better.
There you go.
I got the community side down, but the education part, I could use your help.
Well, everyone, check Evan out on his website. Look for that course. Sign up for that course if you're engaged in community and ready to build that out, because I know it's important for colleges, and I know it's high on your mind and high on your priorities. And this is a good way to really get started with communities if you're not already. Evan, again, thank you so much for joining me on CRMprov. I'm really glad to have had you here. And for everyone else, thank you so much again for taking time out of your day, your week to join us, to learn and to think more about how we can really leverage CRM to better engage and connect and support our students. And until next time, we'll see you soon.